On behalf of Duke University and the Institute of Policy Sciences and Public Affairs, it is my honor to welcome His Excellency Oscar Arias to this interview. This interview is conducted under the auspices of the Living History Program. Members of the panel are Lars Schoultz, Professor of Political Science and Head of the Institute for Latin American Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Dr. Peter Smith, Professor of Political Science and Latin American Studies at the University of California at San Diego. I'm William Ascher, Professor of Public Policy and Political Science at Duke University and Director of the Center for International Development Research. President Arias, what prompted you, after earning a law degree in Costa Rica, to pursue graduate work in political science and economics?
Since I was a child, I wanted to participate in politics. This is why we, in Latin America, if we are interested in participating in politics, we usually study law. But I found out that law was not enough. So I wanted to come either to this country or to Europe. When I graduated from the university in Costa Rica, I applied to different universities here in this country, and I was accepted, though I wanted to do some graduate work in Europe, because for us in Latin America it's much easier to come quite frequently to this country, but not to Europe. I got a scholarship from the British Council. I was accepted in London, so I decided to go to Europe for 3 years, where I got a PhD in political science.
Your career path in Costa Rican politics seems rather unusual. You held quite high posts on the economic and technical side of the executive branch, and then ran for Congress. What motivated you to run for Congress and to become so involved in Liberación Nacional?
I come from a very conservative family. My family, all the members of my family are not members of Liberación Nacional, but of a much more conservative party. So in a way, I became some sort of a black sheep in the family. Because when I first met José Figueres, the founder of the party, I decided that I wanted someday to work near him. This was in the early 60s. I was just a student at the University of Costa Rica. So I started reading a lot about the classics, English classics. And I decided when I was about 23, 24 years old that I wanted to become a member of Liberación Nacional, which, as you know, is a social democratic party. Then I graduated and went to London. And when I got back, in late 1969, Costa Rica was in the middle of a political campaign. José Figueres was the candidate for our party, and I decided to participate in that campaign. This is why he later asked me to join his government. He won the election. This was his second presidency. And, well, I had this opportunity to serve in the cabinet as Minister of Economic Planning for 4 years. And then, because I wanted to make a political career, I knew that it was important for me to go to Congress. So I decided to run for Congress. I won a seat, and it was a wonderful experience. I learned a lot. I learned mainly that one needs to be very patient, because there is a need for a lot of patience in Congress. If you come from the executive branch, you are used to do things very rapidly. While in Congress, you need to find out that in order to reach consensus, it takes a lot of time. One has to be very humble, one has to listen a lot, one has to be able to negotiate all the time, otherwise legislature is never approved. One has to be very flexible, one has to understand that one is not always right, that one has to listen to the opponents, to the other parties, if you want to pass some important legislature. And that helped me a lot later on in the negotiations trying to bring peace to Central America.
Sir, may I ask you to go back to your childhood and explain the early political interest that you had, or interest in becoming involved in politics? As a child, did you dream of being president of your country?
Yes, I used to say in my campaign that the first time I wanted to be president of Costa Rica was when I was in my mother's womb. And here, this is something that was never quite well understood by Costa Ricans, because many people thought that was some sort of pride. On the contrary, I thought that was a sign of humility. If you're honest, if you tell people what's in your mind, if you don't lie, if you don't cheat anyone, that's a symbol of humility. Even though some people might think it is pride because you could seem to be too ambitious. But there's nothing wrong with ambition. I think that people should be honest and tell people what they want to do in their life. And this is why I never lie to anyone. This is not easy, because in Latin America, I don't know if this is applicable to the rest of the world. If you are honest and you share with other people your ambitions, what you do, what you want to do in life, what you want to do in political life, you'll find many enemies very soon. People who want to stop you, who want to put obstacles into your political career. And this is precisely what happened to me, because I wanted to be so transparent, so honest, intellectually honest, and to share my ambitions, what I wanted to do. I found many political opponents since the early beginning in my political career. But I don't regret anything I did. I think it was very good for me and for my family and for the youth of my country to find someone who, since his childhood, share with the rest of my classmates, in this case, in elementary school as well as in high school, that I wanted to prepare to become president of Costa Rica someday.
And what were the influences that you felt as a child? Was it from your family, or from current events, the revolution of 1948, or peer influences from your classmates? How did this interest develop in your childhood and early youth?
My grandfather, the father of my father, had been a very good politician. And since I was a child, I used to talk to him about his experiences, and he used to tell me some anecdotes. He had been a member of Congress for many, many years, about 30 years. And he had been a member of the cabinet of a couple of presidents, very well-known presidents from my province, two presidents I admire a lot. And because of him, because of many readings, I started to read political biographies since I was a child. I remember having read Churchill's memoirs since I was in high school. And then I read many biographies of famous statesmen from this country: Roosevelt, Churchill, de Gaulle, Truman, Gladstone, Disraeli, well, many, many, many. And then I came to this country once I graduated from high school. I wasn't too sure what to study, so I came to Boston University, where I spent a year and a half. I was planning then to transfer to Harvard, but I wanted to become a medical doctor at that time. So I spent a year and a half at Boston University taking courses in zoology and physics and chemistry, and also courses in zoology, in sociology and history, etc. And it was at the time of the Nixon-Kennedy campaign. This was 1959. So I had a chance, as most of the American people did, to watch on television the debates between Nixon and Kennedy. And being a Latin American in Boston, so much interested in a better relationship between the Latin American nations and the United States, and not very happy with the Eisenhower years, I decided to write as a university student in different university papers. So I wrote on the future of Latin America and the United States a couple of articles. And when Kennedy won the election, I also wrote a letter to him. He later invited a few Latin American students to come to see him to Hyannisport. I was one of them. I admire Kennedy very much, and I was very much inspired by him. So I decided that I was wasting my time studying medicine. I went back and studied law and economics in the University of Costa Rica, and later on I was able to get this scholarship to go to England. I had already spent a year and a half here in America. This is why I preferred to go to Europe this time.
You mentioned being a black sheep in your family. When did that occur, and did that create pressures within the family?
No, not at all. You know, I come from a very conservative family. They are mainly involved in agriculture. My father is a lawyer. He always practiced law and combined the practicing of law with coffee farming. But I decided that I wanted to be some sort of an intellectual, a university professor. So I decided to get a PhD after I graduated in Costa Rica, and to be able to teach, and then of course to get involved into politics. But I wanted to get a good education before going into politics.
President Arias, in response to Professor Smith's previous question, you began a discussion that I think will be very interesting to people who use this document that we're recording now for research in the years ahead, and that was the relationship between you personally and the United States, and you as a Latin American statesman. And I have several questions in that area of U.S. Latin American, U.S. Costa Rican relations that I'd like to ask you. And I'd like to begin, if I can, with a rather difficult question for many people, which is the Latin American perception of how the United States treats the region. You mentioned that you had read President Truman's biography. A couple of years ago, a book was published of the letters between President Truman and his wife Bess. And in that series of letters, there was a special group that came from President Truman in the late 1930s as he was making a trip to Latin America as a member of Congress. He particularly focused on Central America. He was well received by many people in Central America, but he was particularly well impressed with the Somoza government's reception of him. In his letters, he sent back to his wife, there are comments about the character of Latin Americans. He used denigrating terms. I think the word dago was used. He talked about how they need a strong hand to guide them. And in many recent episodes, we've seen something of this attitude. I know you probably remember 2 years ago in Costa Rica, President Bush at a press conference was asked to comment repeatedly upon the activities of President Ortega. And rather than comment on the substance of President Ortega's policies, he chose to comment upon his character. He referred to him as an unwelcome dog at a garden party. He repeatedly called him a little man. One press representative even asked him, "Why do you keep calling President Ortega a little man?" And President Bush responded, "Because that is what he is." My question to you really is if you would discuss the attitude that you have perceived on the part of the U.S. government officials toward Latin Americans, toward Costa Ricans in particular.
Well, I think the the vast majority of Americans know very little about Latin America. The strength of the American people is not geography. Most Americans ignore where Costa Rica is, where Nicaragua is, where Ecuador is, where Peru is. And I think this is also true for countries in other continents. Because this is such a large nation and you are mainly concerned with events in this country. Very few Americans are really interested in international issues. That is a difference between the United States and many European countries. And this is why I wanted to spend some time as a student in Europe, because the perspective of Europe to the rest of the world is different. In the case of Britain, England, 20 years ago when I was a student there, they see the events of the world quite differently to the way you see them. They are no longer a superpower, and because you are a superpower, so you look at the rest of the world with a different perspective. Having said that, we all recognize that the relationship between the United States and Latin America hasn't been a very good one through this century and even the past century. That is not the case with Costa Rica. In the case of Costa Rica, the United States governments in this country were always very supportive of Costa Rican democracy. And where there were some attempts to overthrow democratic governments, Washington was always in favor of our democratic governments and not of our of those men who wanted coup d'etats in my country. That makes a difference with most of the rest of the Latin American countries, when many times Washington supported coup d'etats and eventually supported dictators, if these dictators were friendly to this country. In recent history, that's the case of Fulgencio Batista in Cuba, Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, Somoza in Nicaragua, and many, many others. Costa Ricans like Americans very much. And this is one of the reasons why President Reagan wanted to visit Costa Rica. I don't know how many countries in Latin America he visited, but he was quite sure that he was going to get a very warm welcome in my country. When Vice President Bush attended my inauguration as president in May of 1986, he also got a tremendous welcome. And I think he'll never forget when he walked into the stadium and got this tremendous applause from the audience. This is why 3 years later, he also visited Costa Rica when I was president and he was president. And I hope to find some time to talk about that visit to my country. But in general, I think there's been a lot of neglect from this country toward Latin America. There are so many poor countries in the region, and when the people of Latin America look at this country being so wealthy, so prosperous, there is some sense of envy, and perhaps many people resent that there's no much more solidarity from the rich United States to the poor Latin American countries. If you look at economic aid, well, the aid given to Latin America is very little compared to what you give to other countries in the world, which are very far away from you, which are less poor than the Latin American countries. It is difficult for many Latin American countries to understand why 60% of your foreign aid goes to Israel and Egypt, for instance, and none to some countries in Central America or in South America or in the Caribbean. And when you look at trade, when you look at the transfer of technology, when you look at foreign investment, etc., there is some resentment. I think there is a need for much closer relations between the two Americas. There is a need for a better understanding and for more knowledge from the average American citizen about Latin America. And this is something that you in the academia and we as politicians must do something about it.
Could I follow that question up and ask if you would be willing to turn the question over and talk for a few moments about your initial attitudes toward the United States? How did you first become aware of the United States and its position? How have your attitudes developed over the years? And if you would, have your views changed given the contact you had with the U.S. government while you were president?
Well, in the case of Costa Rica, I had a very difficult time because, as I mentioned, Costa Ricans are very pro-American. And I am also pro-American in the sense that I admire this country, I like the American people, I admire your institutions. I miss we didn't have Thomas Jefferson in Latin America in the previous century. And for Costa Ricans, it was very difficult to understand that being the Costa Rican people quite friendly toward the United States and the US people and US governments, I dared to disagree with the US government in 1986. First, being a university professor, and because to govern is to educate, I had to educate the Costa Rican people so that they would understand that to disagree with a friend doesn't make you an enemy. That it is quite understandable that friends sometimes agree and sometimes disagree. But if you have to agree all the time, that's not friendship, but servilismo. What's the word for that, Bill?
Being servile.
Being servile. So I wanted Costa Ricans to understand the difference between being servile and being friendly. Because indeed I had to disagree a lot with President Reagan. We simply had a different attitude toward the problems of Central America. We wanted a different solution to the conflict in Nicaragua. His solution was through war, through violence, supporting the Contras to make a war in Nicaragua. And my solution, according to Costa Rican sentiments, to Costa Rican values, trying to interpret Costa Rican values and sentiments and principles, I decided to introduce a peace initiative and to practice dialogue, what we always practice in Costa Rica. We try to settle our differences always at the negotiating table, as civilized people. And well, it was very difficult for Costa Ricans to be able to understand my attitude. Besides, Costa Rican press was very conservative, very reactionary, and they were not in favor of the peace plan. They paid a lot of lip service to the peace plan because this was something very Costa Rican. But indeed, they were not very hopeful that through the peace plan we could ever reach a solution to the conflict in the region. And when I had to disagree, and this became very obvious that President Reagan wasn't too happy with the peace plan, with my initiative, they supported more Washington than San Jose, than the Arias administration. So it was a quite difficult time for me during those 3 years until at the end we were able to succeed. And of course, Costa Rica found very proud when they were able to see that the peace plan succeeded and that the support I got from the entire world was because the whole world wanted to praise our efforts to bring peace to the region.
May I explore just one aspect of that? Was it that the Costa Rican public and press agreed with President Reagan in his analysis, in his attitudes, and in his policies? Or was it that they were afraid that Costa Rica might be punished because of your disagreement? That is, was it agreement with his views or fear of punishment?
Both sentiments. They were afraid of some punishment, economic punishment. I remember the editorials in our newspapers telling me, how can you dare to disagree with Washington if we are getting 100 million in foreign aid? How can you dare to disagree with Washington if all of our exports go to new, non-traditional exports go to the US market? How can you dare to disagree with Washington if the foreign investment we are getting comes mainly from US firms, US companies? On the other hand, they were not too convinced that I was right. As many people in the Reagan administration, conservative people in my country sincerely thought, that it was not possible to get rid of the Sandinistas through elections, that it was not possible to do something different in Central America, that after 1917 until 1986, no Marxist, Communist, Leninist regime had been thrown out through free elections, and that it was very naive of me to believe that Daniel Ortega would ever hold free elections. So there were both sentiments.
May I ask you to elaborate on the other forms of opposition in Costa Rica to your peace initiative? Was there a sense of isolationism among some sectors of Costa Rican society not to be as heavily involved in Central America? What did you do to convince people that Costa Rica had to be involved in Central American problems instead of trying to distinguish itself as somehow different from the other Central American countries?
Well, there was a criticism bill during the 4 years of my administration. But this usually happens to many statesmen in the world. If they become interested in foreign issues, they are always criticized at home because they are not really concerned with domestic issues. In my case, I didn't lie to anyone. I didn't cheat anyone, because during the campaign, peace became the most important issue. And during the campaign, I told the Costa Rican people that we used to play a very passive role in foreign affairs, and that I wanted to change that. That Costa Rica had the moral authority in Central America to share the peace we enjoy with the rest of the Central American peoples. And that I wanted to make of my foreign policy an active agent. Those were the precise words I used. An active agent in trying to bring peace to the region. So people knew what I was going to do. When I became president, I supported Contadora. Contadora was the only peaceful solution at that time. I supported Contadora, and I knew that Daniel Ortega was not being very honest, very sincere when he was supporting Contadora. He wanted a peaceful solution because he wanted to get rid of the Contras, and he wanted to influence North Americans, US Congress, not to support militarily the Contras. But Contadora never succeeded for one very simple reason. It was a very complicated peace initiative. You know, there were many different chapters, and the essence of Contadora was, let's deal first with the national security of the Central American countries, and then we'll be able to talk about peace. My peace plan was a very simple equation. First democracy, then peace, and then economic and social development. There's no durable peace without democracy. For many, that was a trap to Daniel Ortega. For most of us, and for me, it was the sincere interpretation of a Costa Rican citizen of how to achieve peace. And the best example is my own country. Unless Nicaraguans feel that they have had the chance to elect a president at the ballot box through a free election, there will never be peace in that country. So that was the main essence of my peace initiative. And this is why it was successful, because I think it was a good answer to the demands of 27 Central Americans who wanted democracy in order to attain a durable peace.
President Arias, if I could follow up on that comment of the nature of the plan's success. There are varying interpretations of why it was successful, and the most common interpretation in the United States is that it was successful because it had a tenacious proponent who refused to give up. We don't have a lot of information from first-person participants, but one of the people who's provided most information in English about the peace process is Frank McNeil, the former ambassador to Costa Rica. He's written a book, and last week he presented a paper in Washington at a meeting of the Latin American Studies Association on the Arias peace plan. And I'd like, if I could, to read you 3 sentences that provide his understanding of why the plan was successful, and ask if you would comment on these 3 sentences. He says, "The strength of the plan lay in Arias's refusal to take no for an answer. He understood the gut interests of other Central American states and the psychology of their presidents, particularly Nicaragua's Daniel Ortega. If Arias's vision was Wilsonian, his tactics were not nearly so inflexible. At critical moments, Arias accepted suggestions so long as they did not alter the plan's essence." Could you begin to comment on Ambassador McNeil by talking about these critical moments and the suggestions that you accepted that did not alter the plan's essence?
When I became president, Vice President Bush visited me. We had a long talk just before the inauguration. And he said to me, "We know we disagree." By that time, I had already opposed more aid to the countries. This was in February of 1986. And many officials here in Washington were not very happy with my comments on more aid to the countries or no more aid to the countries. So Mr. Bush knew that we were going to disagree. At that time, I had no intention of drafting a peace plan. I was simply trying to support Contadora. Contadora was an initiative which was not easy for those countries who belong to the Contadora group to be very persuasive in Central America, because many Central American countries were not too happy with Panama and Mexico telling us what to do and talking about democracy for the region. So, because they had no moral authority to come to preach to Central America how to become more democratic and peaceful, I knew that Contadora was going to fail. But at that time, in May of 1986, I had no plans for introducing any peace initiative. Washington wasn't too happy with my attitude, and they never invited me to come to Washington in an official visit. I put some pressure on the ambassador at that time because I wanted a friendly relationship with Washington, and because I also wanted to explain to Washington officials what was in my mind. Even though we were disagreeing, I wanted them to understand what was in my mind. At the end, I was invited to come to Washington. This was in December of 1986. I had a chance then to talk to Vice President Bush, as well, of course, as to President Reagan. To Vice President Bush, I told him that if Contadora would fail, I wanted to propose a Costa Rican peace initiative. And I shared with him some ideas about this proposal, about this initiative. It was in February of 1987 when I invited the Central American presidents to attend a meeting in Costa Rica, and I introduced my peace initiative. At the very beginning, Washington did not support it because it was not a peace initiative against Nicaragua. It was in favor of democracy, but it was not something against Nicaragua. So from February to the beginning of August, when we, the 5 Central American presidents, met in Guatemala, all I got was lip service from Washington. On the other hand, Nicaragua wasn't too happy with the initiative. At the very beginning, they thought I was just an instrument of US policy. Later on, they found out that it was not a peace plan against Nicaragua, but in favor of democracy. And again, just like Daniel Ortega in the past had paid a lot of lip service to Contadora, he again paid a lot of lip service to the Arias plan, as it was called here in this country. During those months, I decided to try to rally some support for the peace plan. I visited some Latin American countries in the South. I went to Europe. I saw many heads of state in Europe. I had a long meeting with the Pope. And in Europe, for instance, I got a huge support from everybody, except perhaps Mrs. Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher told me that I was very naive to trust Daniel Ortega. How can you trust a communist? How can you trust in free elections in a communist country? With her exception, I got a tremendous backing from Germany, from Belgium, from Spain, from France, from most countries. I came back and I again found many difficulties. Washington decided to appoint Ambassador Habib as ambassador at large in Central America. And he was very good in trying to reach consensus among the Central American presidents. And he was the one who wanted me to change a few words, a few phrases. And I was very flexible. Indeed, I was very flexible. He was very helpful. He had all this tremendous experience in diplomacy. I had no experience in diplomacy. All I had was a lot of patience. A lot of patience to deal with Daniel Ortega on one hand and Napoleon Duarte on the other. And of course, Napoleon Duarte as well as Escona were under very heavy pressure from Washington. So it was Ambassador Habib who helped me. And when I say helped me, it's because he was very close to me and tried to be very helpful with me, trying to, to make a better plan. So I paid a lot of attention to him. I used to listen to him with tremendous attention. And at the end, we postponed the meeting in Guatemala because of pressures from the US to Honduras and to El Salvador. So Napoleon Duarte asked me to hold first a meeting of foreign ministers. And I knew that foreign ministers would never agree on anything because, because of many obvious reasons, but they would never agree on anything. So I decided to travel to Central America in order to persuade my colleagues that we had to meet, that we couldn't postpone once again our meeting. So that meeting was held in August of 1987, the 7th of August. And when I left my country, the odds were that we would never reach a consensus, that we would never reach an agreement. No one was prepared to bet a penny on the Central American peace plan. If we were able to succeed, it was because Daniel Ortega never had expected that Napoleon Duarte as well as Ascona would be in favor of our peace initiative. You know, he always bet, just like in the past with Contadora, that he would be always the good guy saying, yes, here I am, prepared to sign anything you want. But he knew that the others would never sign Contadora, that is El Salvador and Honduras. In this case, it was for him quite a surprise to find out that Napoleon Duarte and President Ascona were prepared to reach an agreement. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, I told Vinicio Cerezo, listen, we cannot go out of this room because if Daniel Ortega makes some phone calls to his brother or to Thomas Borges in Managua, I'm sure he won't be prepared to sign later on. So we must sign now at 4 o'clock in the morning. If we wait until tomorrow morning, we might not have his signature. So that's what we did. You know, I locked that room until they all promised to me that they were prepared to sign, and it was quite a surprise to everyone, to everybody, even to me. I wasn't too convinced when I left Costa Rica that I was going to be able to reach a consensus between mainly El Salvador and Nicaragua.
You mentioned the hesitancy of the United States, Mr. President, and you referred to meeting with President Reagan and Vice President Bush and Ambassador Habib. One question that many people have raised is about who was really making U.S. policy, who controlled U.S. policy on Central American questions at that time. Much has been said of the role of Assistant Secretary of State Elliott Abrams, of the National Security Council, of Oliver North, and of others. Who did you feel, who did you understand really to be making the policies within the U.S. at that time?
Well, I would say that many people, Peter, but not George Shultz. In the State Department, it was Elliott Abrams, the one dealing with Central America, not Mr. Shultz. In the Pentagon, the Secretary, Mr. Weinberger, Bill Casey from the CIA, Mr. Calucci eventually, but not Mr. Shultz. I don't think Mr. Shultz agreed with that policy. He went along with the policy, but I don't think, and now I think I can say this. At that time I wasn't too sure. But I don't think he was totally convinced that that was the right policy. He wanted to give peace a chance, and he wanted the peace plan to be given an opportunity. When I first talked to Mr. Schultz, he of course supported Reagan's policy. but I found that he was not too convinced. You know, I used to meet many people. Mr. Casey wanted to see me. I decided not to see him because the message I sent to him is, you're welcome to come, but we'll meet in front of the press. But he wanted a private meeting. Later on, we met in Washington, but again, in front of the press. He didn't know that, but he came to visit me, and he was quite surprised when he found out that I was along with the Costa Rican press and international press. But I want to share with you the fact that there was a lot of pressure for me to help the Contras in my country, to allow the Contras to use our territory. When I decided to expel the Contras from my country, that was perhaps too much for the Costa Rican press and many conservative Costa Ricans. They thought that I was too provocative to Washington. But I wanted to be very transparent. I wanted to be very sincere. I hated when someone asked me, is it true that in private you say this, but in public you say that, something different? That really worried me and bothered me and hurted me. So I wanted to be very transparent. And I wasn't being frank enough, sincere enough, transparent enough. If on one hand I was fighting the Contras, and on the other hand I was allowing the Contra leaders to live in our country. So I decided to give them a chance. Either you resign to be a Contra leader and you stay in Costa Rica and enjoy our hospitality, or you go to Miami. And 4 of them, there were 5, left to Miami. Only Alfonso Robelo stayed, and he resigned as a Contra leader. So, coming back to your question, I would say that it wasn't the State Department. It was mainly the CIA.
And after the agreement was signed in that dramatic early morning session that you described earlier, did the United States actively oppose it, try to sabotage the agreement in some way? Did you feel that even though the agreement was signed by all parties, that there was really very strong resistance from the U.S., or did the U.S. back off and wait?
For many, it was a surprise that we would reach an agreement, but mainly to U.S. officials. They never expected this. Let us remember that a few days before the 7th of August, another peace plan was introduced in Honduras, written in English, not in Spanish. And I think it was on the 3rd of August that also another peace plan was introduced. It was called the Wright-Reagan Peace Plan. I called my colleagues Ortega, Ascona, Cerezo, and Duarte, and told them that I would not attend that meeting in Guatemala if they were prepared to look at the other peace plans. That the only way I could attend that meeting is if we would concentrate only on the Costa Rican Peace Initiative and forget about the rest. And this is why I was able to attend the meeting, because they said, yes, don't worry, Mr. President. So perhaps some US officials were not too happy because we never considered the 2 other proposals, and because we were able to reach an agreement. And now perhaps I can say this. I've been able to meet Mr. Habib recently, and he has told me that once the peace plan was signed, he wrote a long memo to President Reagan asking him to support the plan, to strongly support the plan. And the response he got was no. So they kept paying lip service to the plan, but at the same time, they kept insisting that the only way to get rid of the Sandinistas was through the Contras. And that was the second meeting of the Central American presidents, that meeting of August 1987. But then we met many, many, many other times in different parts of Central America. I remember that at the very beginning, Ortega did not want to meet the Contras. At the very end, he wanted the Contras to come to see him to Managua. At the very beginning, he said to me that he would never allow any Contra leader to come to Nicaragua. So I arranged for the Sandinistas and the Contras to meet in the Dominican Republic. But at the very end, the Sandinistas had agreed to hold free elections. I wanted Daniel Ortega to advance those elections because every time we didn't comply with certain parts of the Esquipulas II Accord, there was a lot of pressure from Washington, in my own country, from the right all over the world, for us to recognize that the plan had failed. And I had this pressure for 3 years until 1990. You know, I was all the time under this tremendous pressure for me to accept that, well, the plan was no good, that Ortega was not compliant. And of course, the words used were, you are too naive, you are too candid, you are too full, you are, in a way, an ally of Daniel Ortega, serving his purposes. So it was indeed very difficult because Costa Rican public opinion was very skeptical. Now, when I won the Nobel Peace Prize, there was a sense of pride in Costa Rica. But for many right members of the right in my own country, I never deserved that prize. And they even wrote editorials, Mr. President, you should return that prize because there's no peace in Central America. Why are you going to keep that prize if still there is no peace in Central America? So I kept insisting and insisting. And I think the clue was elections in Nicaragua. We traveled to Venezuela for the inauguration of Carlos Andrés Pérez. We all traveled in the same plane with Felipe González. And we met in Venezuela one evening until 4 o'clock at night. Carlos Andrés, Daniel Ortega, and Fidel Castro. I think at least during a couple of hours, someone else was present. But the three of us met for quite a long, long time. And I was trying to persuade Daniel that he had to advance his elections, because unless he would prove to the world that he could win a real free election, we were not going to be able to stop that war. So he said yes to me. He said yes to me, and so he advanced the elections in order to be held in February of 1990. So since then, we started to, by we I mean the Venezuelans, the US, the Europeans, Costa Ricans, and many other governments, to support the electoral tribunal in Nicaragua. We had many difficulties because no one trusted that tribunal, so we had to change the integration of the members of the tribunal, etc. But at the end, well, elections were held. I knew that the Sandinistas were going to lose that election. I told Daniel Ortega to prepare himself because he was going to lose. He never believed this. So I called his ambassador. I called different members of the Directorio Nacional, a few comandantes. They came to Costa Rica, and I told them, well, you better prepare yourselves because you are going to lose that election. But again, no one believed they could ever lose that election. I knew because it was not possible for the Sandinistas to win. The Nicaraguan people knew that if the Sandinistas would win that election, they were going to have war for many, many more years.
Mr. President, you've several times mentioned the importance of elections in Nicaragua to the success and implementation of the peace plan. My question is, did you derive any optimism or hope about the possibility of elections in Nicaragua from the Nicaraguan election of 1984? Did you see that as a sign that the Sandinista regime could hold an election? Or, like many observers, did you regard that as a fraudulent exercise and something that would have to be overcome?
Well, let me put it this way. When the Sandinistas came into power, they came to stay. They never dream of giving up power. As a matter of fact, when we first met in late May of 1986, the 5 Central American presidents in Esquipulas, small town in Guatemala, I told Daniel Ortega that the main difference between him and the rest of us was that we were prepared to become leaders of the opposition while he was not. And he agreed with me. He said, you must understand, Oscar, that Nicaragua is not Costa Rica and that we don't want to become another Costa Rica. So I said to him, it's indeed very sad if what you are saying is that you want to make of Nicaragua a second Cuba, because what you promised to the world and to the Nicaraguan people was a new Nicaragua. And if when we Costa Ricans supported the Sandinistas and we allowed our territory to be used by the Sandinistas because we hated Somoza, as we hate all dictators, we always thought that you had in mind a new, free Nicaragua. So the elections of 1984 might not have been very free because it was not in the mind of the Sandinistas to hold free elections. But nevertheless, the US put a lot of pressure on the opposition so that they would not participate in that election. So there were many doubts about that election. But anyway, for the 1990 elections, I knew that those elections were not going to be like elections in France or Britain or the US or Costa Rica. But that is the norm, that is the rule in most Latin American countries. You cannot expect elections in Honduras, in Ecuador, in Peru, in El Salvador to be like those in the United States or in Costa Rica. So what I did was that I wanted to get all the assistance from most countries I could. So I asked the Germans, I asked Felipe Gonzalez, I asked Carlos Andrés Pérez, our own electoral tribunal traveled to Managua for months and months. We asked for computers, we asked for all the technical assistance possible so that those elections were as free as they could be.
Thank you.
You mentioned before that there was much surprise that Presidents Duarte and Ascona supported the peace plan, and that in a way Daniel Ortega ended up agreeing with a peace plan that some people had seen as risky for his political future. Did you take any efforts to communicate with Presidents Duarte and Ascona to convince them to support the peace plan despite all this pressure from the United States government?
Yes, I think, Bill, the reason, or one of the main reasons why President Duarte and Ascona agreed to sign the peace initiative was because we introduced this idea of simultaneidad in order to comply in a simultaneous way the 5 Central American governments, so that the Salvadorans wouldn't have to wait for the Nicaraguans to do this, for them to do something else. And this provided perhaps more confidence to Ascona and to Napoleon Duarte that they would be able to check on the sincerity, on the goodwill of Daniel Ortega, to see if he would comply or not. And this is why, as I mentioned earlier, every time he didn't comply, there was a lot of pressure from Washington, from public opinion, and from the armies in El Salvador and Honduras. Let us remember that the Honduran army was very much in favor of the Contras. They were not supportive of the peace plan. They were very much identified with U.S. policy. They were allowing Honduran territory to be used by the Contras, as we all know. So they totally convinced that the only way was through violence to get rid of the Sandinistas. So it was very difficult for Ascona to disagree with his army. And it was sometimes too difficult for Napoleon Duarte to disagree with the Salvadoran army. Let us always remember that in most of these countries, presidents are not very free. Sometimes they are prisoners of their own armies.
Did you find, though, that there were some actions that you could take to reassure Presidents Duarte and Ascona that they could go ahead with the peace plan and not run into opposition that they simply could not do anything about?
Well, we used to talk over the phone almost every week. You know, we were in permanent contact. And I tried to be helpful with, talking to the generals in the Salvadoran army when it was needed, also in the Honduran army. And because we kept meeting, we were able to sometimes to advance, sometimes some steps backward were taken. At that time, I had this tremendous pressure to recognize that the peace initiative had failed. And again, it was very difficult because U.S. pressure was very heavy. But the best ally I had in my search for peace in the region was the U.S. press. And I would say world press, but mainly U.S. press. I remember talking to so many journalists in this country, and they were always so supportive, and they always understood the difficulties we had ahead of us. This is why I always was very confident, because, well, first of all, in the search for peace, there cannot be permanent defeats. It was a matter of patience. It was a matter of perseverance. And let me make a contrast between our attitude and that of the Persian Gulf now. You know, I found out in Central America that deadlines were traps. Every time we established an ultimatum, a deadline, and we were not able to comply, people used to say, well, you should admit that you have failed. Look what has happened. The Sandinistas haven't complied. When on the 29th of November, the Security Council established an ultimatum for the Iraqi forces to withdraw from Kuwait, the 15th of January, I knew that war was going to be inevitable. You cannot solve in 6 weeks what hasn't been solved in many, many years. So I learned from the Central American experience that what one needs is political will, patience, prudence, humility, flexibility, if you want diplomacy to succeed.
I understand that there was a major concern within Costa Rica that with the activities of the Contras and with the conflicts in the region, that Costa Rica too might run the risk of becoming militarized. What actions did your administration take to make sure that that did not occur?
We did not take very seriously those advices. I think it was Jean Kirkpatrick and some others who said that Costa Rica was not a viable country without an army, that we needed to establish an army sooner or later. But I don't think we took that very seriously. No one did. Under no circumstances, Costa Rica is going to establish an army. On the contrary, I think our duty is now to share our experience with other countries in Latin America and in the developing world, to show other countries that armies are not needed, that there's no use for them. With the end of the Cold War, there's even less use for them. I don't see Costa Rica being invaded by Panama or by Nicaragua. In the worst moments, never the Sandinistas dare to threaten us with an invasion. They invaded Honduran territory because the Contras were there. But I never gave any excuse to Daniel Ortega because he knew that I was being sincere, and not 1 inch of Costa Rican territory was used by the Contras with my knowledge. So he never dared to cross the border because he knew that Venezuela, the US, Panama, many countries in Latin America at the OAS would intervene if Costa Rica would be attacked. So, well, for us, Costa Ricans, there's so much pride by not having an army and being able to spend our money in the satisfaction of our basic needs that will never occur.
You mentioned the problems associated with deadlines. There was a kind of deadline that is the conclusion of your own term in office. Let me ask you about 2 hypothetical questions and invite you to speculate. Suppose the Sandinistas had won the election in Nicaragua. How would that have affected the peace process? That is, was its success contingent only on a free election or on the defeat of the Sandinistas that would allow other dialogue to go forward? And secondly, suppose those things had not occurred during your term in office. Many people associate the plan with you, with your vigor, with your leadership, with your determination, with your decisiveness. What if those things had not occurred before you left office? That is why you were still able to provide the leadership that you did. Would your successor have carried on, do you think? So those are 2 hypothetical questions.
Well, my successor, let me say this about Mr. Calderon. If he had won the election in 1986, he ran against me and he was defeated. I don't think Costa Rica, well, let me put it this way. I think Costa Rica would have been involved in that war. And we would have allowed Costa Rican territory to be used by the Contras. And eventually, we might, at the end, organize some sort of civilian forces or to fight the Sandinistas, because I don't think he had the determination, the courage, the guts to say no to President Reagan. Because of many reasons. He was supported by the Republican Party. His party belongs to this conservative international. But not only because of that, but because I don't think he would have dared to disagree with the President of the United States with so much Costa Rican pressure in favor of a violent solution. 4 years later, we Costa Ricans have found out that he told people what they wanted to hear. I remember that I used to repeat Kennedy's phrase that it is more important to tell people what they should know and not what they want to hear. And that's what I did. So when polls indicated to me that most Costa Ricans did not want me to disagree with the President of the United States, I never mind. I kept insisting that I had to educate Costa Rican people. And at the end, let me tell you, at the end, not when I won the Nobel Peace Prize, but when the Sandinistas were defeated, and when we were able to convene the Hemispheric Summit in October of 1989 in San Jose, then Costa Ricans understood all I had done. And I stepped down from office with a very high popular opinion because Costa Ricans, feel a sense of pride because we did things and took decisions according not to opinion polls, but to values, to principles, to ideals. And this is something the world needs. You know, leaders who do not take decisions according to opinion polls in order to win future elections, but to values and principles and ideals. And this was recognized in the case of Costa Rica. And this is a sense of pride for the Costa Rican people.
You mentioned that you had a moment when you had to say no to Mr. Reagan and the U.S. administration. And if I recall correctly, many senior U.S. officials talked about putting you in the deep freeze, was the words that were used. I wonder if you would comment on exactly what the deep freeze meant. What happened to your relations with the United States during the darkest moments?
To be honest, even though I disagreed with officials in Washington, Congress was very supportive. Even the Republican Party voted in favor of the peace plan. And public opinion was also in favor of the peace plan. And the press was also in favor of the peace plan. So my disagreement was with some members of government. Let me tell you this. This anecdote explains many things. I came to this country in June of 1987 on an unofficial visit to Indianapolis. And while in Indianapolis, I got an invitation from Vice President Bush. He wanted me to come to Washington to meet him. A few hours later, I also got a phone call from the White House that President Reagan wanted to see me, that if I was coming to Washington, he then wanted to see me. So I came to see President Reagan. We had a long discussion. I kept telling him that the US was totally isolated, that no one was supporting his policy, that in his own country, people were not happy with the military support to the Contras, that he was wrong in identifying the Contras with the freedom fighters. I don't think Jefferson and Washington deserve that comparison. And while being in Washington, I was invited by Jim Wright to address a joint session of Congress. He tried to arrange this invitation with Senator Dole, and the White House opposed to my visit to the US Congress. So after a long, long discussion, I wasn't able to accept an invitation to address a joint session of Congress, but I was able to accept an invitation to address a joint meeting of Congress. So they were never too happy with what I was doing, but they never dare to punish Costa Rica economically, because I had too many friends in Washington. I had too many friends all over the world. And it was very difficult for them to try to explain how they would punish someone because he's trying to change an undemocratic government through the ballot box. Let me tell you another anecdote. In my way to Oslo, I stopped in New York. I met many friends. I attended a few dinners. And while being at the hotel, I was visited by Eliot Abrams and some other people. And they told me that the president wanted to say hello to me and to congratulate me on the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, I got this phone call from Mr. Reagan. And he indeed congratulated me. We talked for a few minutes about Central America. But at the end he said, "Don't forget, Mr. President, the Contras." So he was totally obsessed with the Contras. This is something I never understood. But at the end, I think that they have accepted that it was worth trying dialogue and diplomacy.
So during this period of disagreement with the Reagan administration, you'd never received word from your own ministers that economic connections with the United States were being threatened, that there was some hint that the United States would try to sabotage your economic policies in order to increase dissent at home as punishment?
No, but let me put it this way. There are many subtle ways how to do that, how to exercise pressure. You know, no one would dare to tell me, because knowing me, they knew that I was going to tell the whole world about these pressures, about this sabotage, about these threats. But there are many subtle ways how to exercise pressure. For instance, you simply don't disburse the money from AID. And you can always find excuses for not disbursing those funds. You have to do this, you have to do that, you do what you have been asked, And then they ask for more. Oh, but you have to reduce the deficit in 1% more, and that's going to take 4 months. Or you have to take some monetary new measures, or you have to change your exchange rate policy. You know, there are many subtle ways if you want to put some pressure on a small government.
Mr. President, the Nobel Peace Prize is a great personal honor. It can also be a political instrument. To what extent was it helpful to you in achieving the success of the plan? How much did it help shield you a bit from international or U.S. pressures during the course of the plan itself?
Oh, I think it was a tremendous benefit for the success of the peace plan to have won the Nobel Peace Prize. Because the only way how this prize has to be understood is that the committee in Oslo awarded me with the Nobel Peace Prize because they wanted to support the peace initiative, not because we had already obtained peace in the region, but they were telling the world that we were in the right track, that we were doing the right things, that Central Americans deserve the support of the whole world. You know, this was the signal of the Oslo Committee. So, because of the prestige of the Nobel Peace Prize, the whole world, with the exception of Washington, was totally convinced that this was the only way to resolve the conflicts in the region.
I have one final question concerning the United States. If I could ask you to comment about your relationship with the Agency for International Development and other organs of the United States government that provide international assistance. I know you're aware that the United States had no aid program until after World War II, and then we proceeded along 2 tracks, a military aid program with which Costa Rica, of course, had no experience, and an economic aid program that, as you indicate, has the potential to be used as a political tool in international relations. During the term that you were president, a 3rd type of assistance was developed, which in Washington is now called political aid, often thought primarily to work through the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, and the Office of Democratic Initiatives of the Agency for International Development. These are institutions of the U.S. government that are used to support democratic parties in the region, to encourage reform of the administration of justice, to encourage professionalization of staffs of legislatures, and similar activity, political aid, aid for the politics, and we hope the democratic politics of the region. But there's always a possibility that this type of aid can be misused, just as the economic aid can be misused. As a Latin American statesman, and could you tell us how you perceive this aid and how you think it might evolve in the years ahead?
Well, I know that the Christian Unity Party in Costa Rica has been a recipient of this, as you say, political aid. They received some funds in order to finance an institute they have in San Jose. And as long as, you know, it is to educate leaders, I think it is fine. As long as it is misused and could be applied in a political campaign, then I think it's not a good thing. Nevertheless, we must accept that even if the funds come in order to finance some activities of an institute or a center in order to educate the leadership of the party, it is a way to support a campaign. What you need to do is to provide these funds to different parties with different ideologies, you know, to balance your support to democratic parties. But this is also the case with the German foundations. In most of Latin America, you find foundations competing in Latin America. The Adenauer Foundation, the Ebert Foundation, the Newman Foundation, trying to support the conservative parties, the social democratic parties, and the liberal parties. God, and we in Latin America ask ourselves, can they get together and support the real problems in order to strengthen our democratic institutions and not to compete among themselves, using us in the third world? This could be also applied to US funds to democratic parties all over the world.
Asking the same question in a somewhat different way, Mr. President, what advice would you give to the United States for the promotion of democracy in Latin America? Would it be, in the long run, to promote economic and social development? Would it be to not interfere in domestic politics in Latin America in the way that these aid programs threaten to do? Would it be to professionalize the military? Or would it be to simply promote trade and respectful relations between the countries of the Americas and adopt a policy of non-interference, if there were such a thing?
I would say that the best way to promote democracy in the developing world, and now in particular in Latin America, in the beginning of the 90s, where democracy is the rule and dictatorship is the exception. Only Fidel Castro has become the exception in this part of the world. The best way to promote democracy is if we, through democratic governments, can show our people that democracy works, that democracy delivers the goods, that democracy is capable of solving the basic needs of our people. If we fail to do that, and the 90s become a lost decade as the 80s, then it is going to be very difficult to consolidate democracy. Why should people accept a new political system if it makes you poorer and poorer every day? So I don't think we can afford another lost decade in the 90s. That is the main challenge for Latin America today. And if we could get some more support from the US and rich countries, now that the attention is in Europe, in the Soviet Union, in the Persian Gulf, well, that is the great challenge we have in front of us.
President Arias, I have two questions. One is to follow up on the issue of foreign assistance. Of course, it's not just the United States and other bilateral donors who have been providing aid to Central America. It's also the multilateral institutions such as the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank. What position did they take during the period when Costa Rica may have been worried about the U.S. government cutting back on aid to Costa Rica?
No, they were always very supportive of my government, of my country. My criticism to those multinational institutions is the fact that they take in consideration for economic support to governments only economic performance. The cruelest dictator can be supported by the World Bank and the IMF and AID if he is applying the economic policy which satisfies those multinational institutions or Washington. And they don't really care for the abuse in human rights, for lack of freedom, for being a dictatorial government, oppressive government, totalitarian regime. This I miss. Perhaps I'm too naive saying this, but being a Costa Rican, I miss the fact that these tools, these instruments of financial support to the developing world are not also used in order to bring democracy, pluralism, and respect for human rights. And I would even add demilitarization for in the developing world.
We have a final question. You have been president of your country. You have won the Nobel Peace Prize. You are still obviously very young and vigorous. What does the future hold for Oscar Arias? What are your future plans?
Well, I would like to try to promote the Costa Rican model in the rest of Latin America. I don't think it's well known what we have achieved. We have to show the world, not only the developing world, but the whole world, that countries can survive without armies, that armies are not so necessary for the security of a nation, of a people, that if we can rely on international institutions, international organizations like the UN, and now there is hope with the end of the Cold War that the UN can again become the institution, the organization we all dreamed of in 1945, where the Soviet Union and the US can work together. If that is the case, then we should define a different concept of security, and that is to address the basic challenges of the world: inequality, poverty, disease, ignorance, environmental decay. Costa Rica, by not having an army since 1948, has the moral authority to preach to the world that armies are not necessary, and that if one is poor, one has to choose between guns and butter, guns and food, guns and education, guns and health care, guns and the protection of our natural resources. And that's precisely what we have done in the last 45 years.
So you plan to conduct these activities through the Fundación Arias?
Yes. Yes, I want to, through the Fundación, try to show the rest of our neighbors in the region, as well as in South America, that it's worth trying to demilitarize South America and the rest of Central America.
President Arias, thank you very much for doing the interview. Thank you very much, Professors Smith and Schoultz. Let's go on to our next activity. Thanks.